As Karen casually walked through the antique shop, her eyes were drawn to an elaborate display in the far corner. The shelves were lined with ancient artifacts, each more mysterious and sinister than the last, but it was the Ouija board on the center shelf that captured her attention. Unlike any she had seen before, this board was crafted from a pale, bone-like material. Intricate carvings of arcane symbols adorned its surface, and the planchette seemed to glint menacingly under the flickering light of an overhead chandelier. As Karen reached out to touch it, a chill ran down her spine. "Careful with that," came a voice from behind her. She turned to see a shop salesman, a gaunt man with sharp features and piercing eyes, watching her intently. "That's not a toy." "I'm not afraid," Karen replied, her curiosity piqued. "What's so special about this one?" The salesman stepped closer. His expression was serious. "That board is made from human bones," he said, his voice low and grave. "It was crafted by an ancient cult using the remains of a powerful sorcerer executed for necromancy. They believed the sorcerer's spirit could be bound within the board, granting it immense power." Karen felt a thrill of both excitement and apprehension. Why would someone make such a thing? "To harness the sorcerer's power, or to control the spirit," the salesman explained. "But it's dangerous. The spirit within is malevolent, and those who use the board risk unleashing his wrath." Despite the ominous warning, Karen couldn't resist the allure of the board. She had always been fascinated by the occult, and this seemed like the ultimate find. She picked it up, feeling the cold, smooth surface under her fingers. "I'll take it," she said, ignoring the nagging doubt in the back of her mind. The salesman sighed, a mixture of resignation and concern in his eyes. "Be careful, follow the instructions precisely, and never, ever use it alone." Karen nodded, though her thoughts were already racing ahead to the possibilities. As she paid for the board and left the shop, the salesman's final words echoed in her ears. "Some things are better left undisturbed." That night, as she set the Ouija board on her dining table, all she could think about was why someone would bother to create one using human bones. She would later regret not learning why. The evening air was thick with anticipation, as Karen and her best friend Lily settled into the cozy confines of Karen's living room. The lights were dimmed, casting long shadows across the room, and a circle of candles flickered softly, adding to the eerie ambience. The Ouija board lay in the center of the coffee table, its bone-white surface gleaming in the candlelight. "I can't believe you actually bought the thing," Lily said, eyeing the board warily. "You know these things are just for fun, right? They don't actually work." Karen smirked, a mix of excitement and defiance in her eyes. "We'll see about that. Besides, it's not just any Ouija board. The guy at the shop said it was made from human bones and has some powerful spirit trapped inside." Lily rolled her eyes but couldn't hide her curiosity. "All right, let's get this over with. What do we do?" Karen consulted the old yellow instruction booklet that came with the board. "First, we place our fingers lightly on the planchette. Then we ask a question and let the spirit guide our hands." They positioned themselves around the table, each placing 2 fingers on the planchette. The atmosphere immediately grew tense as Karen took a deep breath. "Is there a spirit here who wishes to communicate with us?" For a few moments, nothing happened. The planchette remained still, and the only sound was the crackling of the candles. Then, slowly, the planchette began to move. Karen and Lily exchanged wide-eyed glances as it glided across the board, spilling out a chilling response. "YES." "Did you move that?" Lily whispered, her voice trembling. "No, I swear," Karen replied, her heart pounding in her chest. Let's ask it another question. What is your name? Karen asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The planchette began to move again, faster this time, as if eager to communicate. It spelled out, Malachi. Malachi, Karen repeated, the name sending a shiver down her spine. What do you want? The planchette zipped across the board, spelling out a single word. F-R-E-E. Suddenly, the room grew colder, and the candles flickered violently. A gust of icy wind swept through the room, extinguishing the flames and plunging them into darkness. Karen and Lily gasped, their fingers still on the planchette, which now felt ice cold. This isn't funny, Karen, Lily said, her voice shaking. I think we should stop. But Karen was transfixed, a mixture of fear and fascination holding her in place. We need to know more. Malachi, how can we free you? The planchette moved with a speed and force that made their fingers ache. It spelled out, B-L-O-O-D. A sudden loud crash echoed from the kitchen, making them both jump. Karen's cat, Midnight, hissed and darted out of the room. The candles flared back to life on their own, casting an ominous glow over the room. Karen and Lily stared at each other, realizing they had unleashed something far more sinister than they anticipated. We need to end this, Lily said, urgently, pulling her hands away from the planchette. Karen hesitated but eventually nodded, removing her fingers as well. Goodbye, Malachi, she said, hoping to close the session properly. But the planchette moved on its own, spelling out a final, chilling message. Too late. The candles went out again, leaving them in pitch darkness. The temperature in the room plummeted, and they could hear the faint, sinister whispers surrounding them. Karen fumbled for her phone, using the flashlight to find the switch for the overhead lights. When the lights flickered on, the room was in disarray. Furniture was overturned, books were scattered, and the Ouija board lay on the floor, the planchette still moving slightly. Karen picked up the board, her hands trembling. We gotta get rid of this thing, she said, her voice filled with fear. Lily nodded, her face pale. Tomorrow, first thing. As they tried to clean up the mess, the weight of their mistakes settled heavily on them. Karen could not shake the feeling that they had crossed a line that night, a line that could not be uncrossed. And as she lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, the whispers from the living room seemed to follow her, a haunting reminder of the spirits they had unwittingly set free. Over the next few days, the atmosphere in Karen's home grew increasingly oppressive. It started with the small things, lights flickering, doors creaking on their own, and cold drafts that seemed to come from nowhere. Karen tried to brush it off as her imagination, but the unease gnawed at her. One evening, while she was reading in the living room, a framed photo of her family fell from the mantel and shattered on the floor. Startled, Karen picked it up and noticed that the glass was cracked in a way that seemed to spell out the letters M and A. She shivered, recalling the name spelled out on the Ouija board, Malachi. Unable to ignore the growing sense of dread, Karen decided to seek help. She visited Dr. Raines, a local demonologist known for his expertise in the occult. His office was filled with ancient books and strange artifacts, and had an air of both mystery and authority. Tell me everything, Dr. Raines said, his eyes serious and focused. Karen recounted the events of the night she and Lily used the Ouija board, describing the messages, the sudden cold, and the unsettling phenomena that followed. Dr. Raines listened intently, nodding. This is more than a simple haunting. The board you described is an artifact of significant power, especially given its macabre construction. The spirit you contacted, Malachi, was likely a sorcerer in life, and his malevolence has only grown in death. What can I do? Karen asked, desperation creeping into her voice. The spirit seeks freedom, Dr. Rain explained, and it appears willing to use you as a conduit. We need to perform a binding ritual to contain it, but be warned, this will be dangerous. That night, Karen returned home with a list of items needed for the ritual. Candles, salt, protective sigils, and a vial of holy water. She called Lily, who reluctantly agreed to help. As they prepared for the ritual, the paranormal activity escalated. Objects flew off shelves, eerie whispers filled the air, and shadows seemed to move on their own. The tension was palpable, and both women were on edge. We need to hurry, Karen said, lighting the candles and placing them in a circle around the Ouija board. They sat on the floor, salt forming a protective barrier around them. Dr. Rains had instructed them on the steps of the ritual, emphasizing the importance of focus and intent. Karen began to chant the incantation Dr. Rains had provided. The air grew colder, and the candles flickered violently. The room seemed to vibrate with dark energy. Lily's eyes darted around, wide with fear. Stay focused, Karen urged, though she herself was trembling. The planchette on the Ouija board began to move on its own, spelling out frantic messages. Release me. Free me. The board seemed to pulse with a life of its own, a palpable malevolence emanating from it. Suddenly, the room plunged into darkness as the candles were snuffed out by an unseen force. The only light came from the faint glow of the planchette, which now hovered above the board, spinning wildly. Karen's voice wavered, but she continued the incantation, her words growing stronger with each syllable. The air around them crackled with energy, and a low guttural growl echoed through the room. A shadowy figure began to form above the Ouija board, its eyes glowing with unearthly light. Malachi's spirit had manifested, and it was furious. The temperature dropped to an unbearable cold, their breath visible on the icy air. Karen, I'm scared, Lily whispered, clutching Karen's arm. Keep going, Karen insisted, her voice resolute. We're almost there. The spirit lunged at them, its form shifting and writhing. Karen threw the holy water at it, and the entity recoiled with a hiss, smoke rising where the water made contact. But it wasn't enough to dispel it. Desperate, Karen picked up the Ouija board and held it aloft. By the power of this board, I command you, Malachi, to be bound. The board vibrated violently, and a blinding light erupted from it. Malachi's spirit screamed, a sound that reverberated through their very bones. The light grew brighter, enveloping the spirit and pulling it back into the board. The room fell silent. The oppressive cold lifted, replaced by a heavy stillness. Karen and Lily sat in the aftermath, breathing heavily, their hands still shaking. Did it work? Lily asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Karen looked at the Ouija board, now inert and lifeless. I think so, she said, but a part of her still felt the lingering presence of Malachi, a dark shadow that had imprinted itself on her very soul. They cleaned up the ritual remnants and secured the Ouija board in a locked chest, determined to keep it sealed away. But the events of that night had left a mark on both women, a sense of foreboding that refused to fade. Karen knew they had only just begun to understand the true depth of the darkness they had unleashed, and the thought haunted her as she lay in bed that night, the whispers of Malachi still echoing in her mind. The following days brought a fragile sense of normalcy to Karen's life, but the tension lingered like a shadow. The Ouija board remained locked in the chest, and Karen made sure to avoid any further interaction with it. Yet the haunting continued, in subtler, more insidious ways, Karen's dreams were plagued by visions of Malachi, his dark form always looming at the edge of her consciousness. One evening, Karen came home to find her apartment in disarray. The drawers were pulled out, their contents strewn across the floor. Her cat, Midnight, was hiding under the couch, hissing and terrified. The sight sent a chill down her spine. "Lily?" Karen called, hoping her friend had stopped by, though she knew it was unlikely. She cautiously stepped further into the apartment, her heart pounding. She found her bedroom door slightly ajar, and as she pushed it open, she saw it. The chest that held the Ouija board was wide open, its contents empty. "No," Karen whispered, a wave of dread washing over her. "This can't be happening." In the center of her bed lay the Ouija board, the planchette placed neatly on top. It was as if Malachi was mocking her, thinking she could contain him. Panic gripped her, and she immediately called Dr. Raines. "I told you to keep it secure," Dr. Raines said, his voice a mixture of frustration and concern. "This is bad, Karen. Very bad." I locked it away," Karen argued, but her voice was tinged with desperation. "What do I do now?" "Come to my office. Bring the board," Raines instructed. "We need to take more drastic measures." Karen carefully wrapped the Ouija board in a cloth and placed it in a sturdy box, trying to ignore the unsettling feeling that it was pulsating with dark energy. She drove to Dr. Raines' office, her mind racing with fear and anxiety. Dr. Raines met her at the door, his expression grave. He led her to a back room filled with arcane symbols and protective charms. "We'll perform a more powerful binding ritual here, but you must understand, Karen. The spirit of Malak is cunning and strong. This will be dangerous." Karen nodded, her resolve hardening. "I'll do whatever it takes. I can't live like this anymore." They began the preparations, setting up a circle of protective runes and lighting candles infused with sacred herbs. Dr. Raines handed Karen a small vial of her own blood, collected from the previous visit. "This is your blood. It's a part of the ritual," he explained. "Malachi seeks freedom through blood, but we'll use yours to bind him instead." Karen shivered at the thought, but understood the necessity. They placed the Ouija board in the center of the circle and began the incantation. The air grew thick with tension, and the room seemed to darken despite the candlelight. As they chanted, the planchette started to move, spelling out frantic messages. "Help me kill them." Malachi's spirit grew more aggressive, the room vibrating with his fury. A cold wind swept through the room, extinguishing several candles. The shadows on the walls seemed to come to life, twisting and writhing. Karen could feel Malachi's presence, his rage palpable. "Stay strong, Karen," Dr. Raines shouted, over the howling wind. "We're almost there." Karen poured the vial of her own blood onto the Ouija board, the liquid seeping into the bone-white surface. The board seemed to absorb it, glowing with an eerie red light. Malachi's form began to manifest, a shadowy figure with glowing eyes hovering above the board. "I command you, Malachi, by the power of this blood and the sacred rites, to be bound forever," Dr. Raines intoned, his voice echoing with authority. Malachi screamed, a sound that resonated deep within Karen's soul. The figure writhed and contorted, fighting against the binding spell. The glow intensified, and Karen felt a searing pain in her chest, as if a part of her was being ripped away. With the final agonizing shriek, Malachi's form was pulled back into the Ouija board. The red glow faded, and the room fell silent. The oppressive cold lifted, replaced by an almost eerie calm. Karen collapsed on the floor, exhausted and trembling. Dr. Raines quickly secured the Ouija board in the lead-lined box, inscribing it with protective runes. "It's done," he said, helping Karen to her feet. "Malachi is bound, but you must remain vigilant. His influence won't disappear overnight." Karen nodded, her body aching with her spirit weary. She knew this was only a temporary respite, but for now, she could breathe a little easier. As she left Dr. Rain's office, the weight of her ordeal pressed heavily on her, a constant reminder of the darkness she had encountered and the lingering presence of Malachi still lurking in the shadows of her mind. Weeks passed, and while the intense paranormal activity had subsided, Karen couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Her dreams remained haunted by Malachi, and strange occurrences continued to plague her daily life. Objects would occasionally move on their own, and she often awoke to find cryptic messages scrawled in condensation on her bathroom mirror. "Free me. Let me out." One night, Karen was jolted awake by a loud crash. She sat up in bed, her heart racing, and listened intently. The noise had come from the living room. She grabbed her phone and crept down the hallway, the dim light casting eerie shadows on the walls. As she approached the living room, she saw the lead-lined box containing the Ouija board lying open on the floor. The protective runes had been scratched off, and the board was missing. Panic surged through her. "No," she whispered, dread tightening her chest. She heard a low guttural growl behind her. Whirling around, she came face to face with Malachi's spirit, now more tangible and terrifying than ever. His eyes glowed with a malevolent light, and his form flickered in and out of visibility, like a dark shadow, fighting to solidify. "Foolish girl," Malachi hissed, his voice echoing unnaturally. "You thought you could bind me. You were but a pawn in my game." Karen stumbled backwards, her mind racing. "What do you want from me?" "Your blood," Malachi snarled. "Your soul. Release me, and I may spare you." Karen's survival instincts kicked in. She ran to the kitchen, grabbing a sharp knife for protection, though she knew it would do little against a spirit. Malachi followed, his form gliding through the air effortlessly. She reached for the phone, dialing Dr. Rains with trembling fingers. The call went to voicemail. "Dr. Rains, it's Karen. Malachi is loose. The board..." Her message was cut off as the phone yanked from her hand by an unseen force and smashed against the wall. Malachi advanced, his presence overwhelming. Karen's thoughts flashed to the vial of her blood that they had used in the previous ritual. She needed to find a way to use it again, to turn his power against him. In a desperate move, Karen bolted to her study, where she kept her research on the occult and the notes from Dr. Rains. Malachi's form grew more distinct, his anger palpable. "You cannot escape me," he roared, the walls vibrating with his rage. Karen rifled to her desk, finding the vial of her blood and the protective charm she had stashed away. Her hand shook as she drew a protective circle on the floor with salt and placed the charms around it. She stepped inside, clutching the vial tightly. Malachi appeared at the doorway, his form solidifying. "This will not save you," he sneered. Karen took a deep breath, holding the vial up. "By my blood, I bind you, Malachi. By my will, I command you to be sealed once more." Malachi lunged at her, but the protective circle flared to life, a barrier that halted his advance. He howled in fury, the sound almost deafening. Karen began to chant the binding spell, her voice growing stronger with each word. The room shook violently as Malachi thrashed against the barrier, his form flickering. The energy around him crackled and the air grew cold. Karen's focus sharpened, her fear giving way to determination. "By the power of my blood, by the strength of my spirit, I command you, Malachi, to be bound." She poured the vial of blood onto the floor within the circle, the liquid glowing with the supernatural light. The glow intensified, enveloping Malachi's form. He screamed, a sound of pure agony as the light pulled him towards the center of the circle. "No!" Malachi bellowed, his form being torn apart by the force of the spell. "You cannot do this." Karen continued the chant, her voice unwavering. The glow grew blindly bright, and with a final ear-splitting scream, Malachi was sucked back into the Ouija board, which appeared in the center of the circle, now cracked and smoking. The room fell silent, the oppressive energy lifting. Karen collapsed to the floor, exhausted but victorious. She stared at the damaged Ouija board, her breath ragged. It was over. For now. As she lay on the floor trying to catch her breath, her phone buzzed. It was a message from Dr. Rains. "On my way. Stay strong." Karen managed a weak smile. She had faced Malachi and survived, but she knew deep down that this battle had left scars, and the shadows of the past would always linger, a reminder of the darkness she had encountered. The days following the climactic encounter with Malachi were a whirlwind of recovery and reflection for Karen. Dr. Rains arrived shortly after her ordeal, finding her exhausted but resolute. He inspected the cracked Ouija board with a mixture of relief and concern. "You did well, Karen," Dr. Rains said, his voice gentle but serious. "But this board, it's still dangerous. We need to destroy it completely." Karen nodded, her eyes lingering on the fractured board. "How do we do that?" "There's a ritual to neutralize its power and to render it harmless," Dr. Rains explained. "We must act quickly before any residual energy can escape." They gathered the necessary items: purified water, a ceremonial dagger, and a sacred fire pit located at the edge of town, where many ancient rituals had been performed for centuries. Karen felt a strange sense of déjà vu as they prepared for the final step in containing Malachi's malevolent spirit. The night was dark and clear as they arrived at the fire pit, a circle of stone surrounding a deep charred basin. The air was crisp, and the sound of the forest around them seemed to hold their breath, as if nature itself was aware of the importance of this moment. Dr. Rains set the Ouija board in the center of the pit and began chanting in an ancient language. Karen watched as he drew symbols in the air with a ceremonial dagger, the blade glinting in the firelight. She poured the purified water over the board, the liquid sizzling as it made contact with the bone-like surface. "The sacred flames will cleanse the board," Dr. Rains said, lighting a bundle of herbs and tossing it into the pit. The flames roared to life, casting an eerie glow over the clearing. Karen stepped back, her heart pounding. As the flames consumed the board, she felt a strange mixture of sadness and relief. The fire crackled and popped, the symbols on the board glowing briefly, before disintegrating into ash. "By these flames, we purify this vessel," Dr. Rains intoned. "By our will, we'll banish the darkness within." The fire blazed higher, and a sudden gust of wind swirled around them. Karen could almost hear Malachi's anguished screams carried on the wind, a final desperate cry as his essence was eradicated. The flames gradually died down, leaving nothing but a pile of smoldering ashes. "It's done," Dr. Rains said, wiping sweat from his brow. "Malachi's gone for good." Karen let out a shaky breath, feeling the tension drain from her body. "Thank you, Dr. Rains. I don't think I could have done this without you." He smiled kindly. "You show great courage, Karen. Many would have faltered, but you faced the darkness head on." As they made their way back to the car, Karen felt lighter than she had in previous weeks. The oppressive weight of Malachi's presence was gone, replaced by a sense of calm and clarity. She knew she still had a long road to recovery, but the worst was behind her. Over the next few weeks, Karen worked to rebuild her life. She cleaned and reorganized her apartment, reclaiming her space from the remnants of the haunting. She also took up meditation and began seeing a therapist to help process the trauma she had endured. Lily visited often, offering support and companionship. The bond between them had grown stronger through their shared ordeal. One evening, they sat on Karen's balcony, sipping tea and watching the sunset. "I'm proud of you, Karen," Lily said, breaking the comfortable silence. "You faced something terrifying and came out stronger." Karen smiled, feeling a warmth in her heart. "I couldn't have done it without you, Lily. You were there for me when I needed you the most." As the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky with hues of orange and pink, Karen felt a sense of peace she hadn't known in a long time. She knew there would still be challenges ahead, but she was no longer afraid. The darkness had been vanquished, and she was ready to embrace the light. One day, Karen received a package from Dr. Rains. Inside was a small, intricately carved box with a note. "For your protection, should you ever need assistance again, you know where to find me." Karen opened the box to find a collection of protective charms and a book of advanced demonology. She smiled, feeling a sense of closure. She placed the box on her shelf, a reminder of the strength she had discovered within herself. As she stood in her living room, looking around at all the lives she had reclaimed, Karen knew she was not alone. She had her friends, her newfound knowledge, and the confidence that she could face whatever came her way. And with that, she turned the page of this dark chapter of her life, ready to move forward with courage and hope. Months had passed since Karen had faced Malachi and emerged victorious. Life had returned to a sense of normalcy, and she was beginning to believe that the nightmare was truly behind her. She had resumed her daily routines, found comfort in the support of her friends, and even started dating again. One evening, after a pleasant dinner date, Karen returned home to find a small package on her doorstep. It was wrapped in plain brown paper with no return address. Puzzled, she carried it inside and placed it on the kitchen table. She carefully unwrapped the package, revealing an old leather-bound book. There was a note tucked inside the cover. "Thought this might interest you. A friend." Curiosity piqued, Karen flipped through the book. It was full of ancient rituals and spells, written in a language she didn't recognize. As she examined it, a particular page caught her eye. It depicted a binding ritual, strikingly similar to the one she had performed with Dr. Rains, but with one significant difference: a final step that had been omitted from their ritual. Her heart began to race as she read the translation at the bottom of the page. To fully seal the malevolent spirit, the vessel must be destroyed at the place of origin. A sinking feeling settled in her stomach. Could it be possible that their ritual had been incomplete? She grabbed her phone and called Dr. Rains, her voice urgent. "Dr. Rains, I found something. A book that suggested that we might have missed a crucial step in binding Malachi." There was a long pause before Dr. Rains responded, his voice grave. "Karen, where did you get this book?" "It was left on my doorstep," she replied, her mind racing. "There's no return address, just a note saying it was from a friend." Dr. Rains sighed. "I need to see this book. Come to my office immediately." Karen quickly gathered the book and drove to Dr. Rains' office. He examined the book with a furrowed brow, nodding slowly as he read the passage. "It seems our initial ritual was indeed incomplete," he said finally. "The true binding must be complete at the site where the board was first created." "Where is that?" Karen asked, dread gnawing at her. Dr. Rains hesitated before replying. The board was crafted in an old abandoned church on the outskirts of town. It's a place of dark history, where many such artifacts were created. Determined to put an end to Malachi's influence once and for all, Karen and Dr. Rains prepared for the final ritual. They gathered the necessary items, including the protective charms from the package and the remnants of the Ouija board, now carefully collected from the fire pit. As they drove to the abandoned church, the sky grew darker, the air thick with an ominous energy. The church stood like a sentinel of forgotten horrors, its dilapidated structure casting eerie shadows in the moonlight. Inside, the air was stale and cold, Broken pews and shattered stained glass windows littered the floor. At the altar, they set up the ritual circle, placing the Ouija board fragments in the center. Dr. Rains began the chant, the ancient words echoing through the empty hall. Karen joined in, her voice strong and determined. As they chanted, the air grew colder, and the shadows around them seemed to pulse with a life of their own. Suddenly, a fierce wind whipped through the church, extinguishing their candles. In the darkness, Karen felt a familiar, chilling presence. Malachi's spirit manifested, more furious and powerful than before. "You think you can defeat me?" Malachi roared, his form towering above them. "You are nothing but pawns in a game you cannot comprehend." Karen's resolve hardened. She held up the protective charms, their faint glow cutting through the darkness. "We'll finish this, Malachi. Your reign of terror ends tonight." Dr. Rains continued the chant, his voice unwavering. The charms in Karen's hands began to pulse with energy, their light growing brighter. Malachi screamed, a sound of pure rage and agony as the light enveloped him. The ground beneath them shook violently, and the fragments of the Ouija board glowed with an intense heat. The church seemed to come alive with a dark energy, the walls vibrating with Malachi's fury. "By the power of this sacred place, by the light of our will, we will command you, Malachi, to be bound forever," Karen shouted, pouring every ounce of her strength into the words. A blinding flash of light erupted from the circle, and Malachi's form was sucked into the board fragments. The ground shook one last time before falling silent. The oppressive cold lifted, replaced by an eerie calm. "It's done," Dr. Rains said, his voice filled with relief. As they gathered the remnants of their ritual, Karen noticed something odd. One of the protective charms had a small inscription on it that she hadn't seen before. She held it up to the light, her eyes widening as she read the words, "Property of Malachi." Her blood ran cold. She looked at Dr. Rains, who was staring at the charm with a mixture of horror and realization. "Karen," he said slowly, "we've been tricked. This charm was his all along." Before they could react, the ground beneath them split open, and a dark, malevolent energy surged forth. Malachi's laughter echoed through the church, as his spirit, now freed and more powerful than ever, rose from the depths. "You cannot bind me," Malachi sneered, his form solidifying. "You have only made me stronger." Karen and Dr. Rains backed away, their hearts pounding with fear. The final twist of Malachi's game had been revealed, and they were trapped in the very place where his power was strongest. As the darkness closed in, Karen realized the true extent of Malachi's cunning. The battle was far from over, and the real fight for her soul was just beginning. The clock had just struck 9:30 p.m. as Eric and I walked down the fog-filled streets, our jackets zipped tight against the night's chill. The city was unusually quiet, the mist swallowing sound and muting the neon lights that flickered above closed storefronts. I stuffed my hands deeper into my pockets, the anticipation building inside me. It was Eric's idea to come out here, to find the infamous diner that only opened at night. I wasn't convinced it was a good idea, but curiosity gnawed at me. "What's the deal with this place again?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper, though I couldn't say why. Maybe it was the fog, or the unsettling silence around us. Eric shot me a grin, his breath visible in the cold air. "Rumor has it, the diner only opens exactly at 10 p.m. and closes before dawn. Some people say it's older than the city itself." He paused for effect. "And of course, the rules. The rules. That's what everyone talked about. Online forums, late-night campus discussions, and even random whispers at parties. The 10 p.m. diner rules were legendary, each more bizarre than the last. Yet despite all the speculation, no one seemed to know why they existed or who enforced them. Some said it was just a quirky tradition to attract business. Others hinted at something darker, a power that the diner held over its patrons. "You think it's just a gimmick?" I asked, trying to sound casual. "Probably," Eric replied. "But isn't that part of the fun? Come on, where's your sense of adventure?" I forced a smile, more to convince myself than him. The idea of the rules didn't sit right with me. But then again, how weird could a diner really be? We turned a corner and the building came into view. It sat at the end of a darkened alleyway, wedged between two ancient brick structures. "There it is," Eric said, nodding towards the dim glow ahead. The diner's facade was cracked and faded, its windows fogged up from the warmth inside. The only signs of life was a flickering neon sign above the entrance, casting a sickly yellow light onto the wet pavement. As we approached, I noticed a faint outline of people through the grim streaked glass. My stomach tightened. "You ready?" Eric asked, grabbing the door handle. I hesitated for a split second, glancing at the street behind us. The fog seemed thicker now, swallowing everything in its path. It felt like the world was closing in on us. I took a deep breath and nodded. "Yeah, let's do this." Eric pulled the door open and we stepped inside. A wave of warm, stale air hit me, carrying with it the smell of old leather, coffee, and a faint hint of something metallic. The interior was dimly lit, casting long shadows across the checkered floor. I scanned the room, trying to get my bearings. Booths lined the walls, the red leather cushions cracked and worn with age. A long counter stretched out on the opposite side, stools with torn fabric tops lined up neatly. There were a few customers scattered around, a man sitting by himself, staring at the window, an elderly couple whispering over their cups, and a lone woman with her back to us, spooning sugar into her drink in a slow, methodical manner. But what struck me the most was how still everything seemed. The other patrons barely moved, their actions sluggish, like they were a part of some strange slow-motion dream. I glanced at Eric, who appeared to have noticed it too. His usual bravado seemed to wane slightly as we walked towards an empty booth in the center of the room. The seats squeaked under our weight as we sat down. Eric, always one for the theatrics, leaned forward and whispered, "Okay, this place is officially creepy." "Yeah, no kidding," I replied, my eyes scanning the room again. Something about the diner made my skin crawl, but I couldn't put my finger on it. It was as if the place itself was watching us. Our conversation was interrupted by the silent arrival of a waitress. She appeared seemingly out of nowhere, placing 2 menus on the table without so much as a word. Her movements were smooth, almost robotic, and she left as quickly as she had come. Eric raised an eyebrow at me, clearly unnerved. "Well, that was something," he muttered. "Guess we're not getting the warm and friendly service tonight." I picked up the menu, my curiosity piqued. It felt old, the plastic cover worn and sticky to the touch. Then, I noticed the writing on the front, bold black letters spelling out, "House Rules." Beneath the title was a list of numbered instructions, each one stranger than the last. Rule 1. Never sit facing the entrance unless you are the first customer to arrive. Rule 2. Never greet the staff when they approach, only speak when spoken to. Rule 3. If a stranger joins your table uninvited, offer them a sip of your drink, then excuse yourself to the restroom. Return only when the diner clock chimes. Rule 4. If you hear soft humming while eating, immediately close your eyes and wait for the humming to stop. Rule 6. If you hear your name whispered from behind you, Do not turn around. Pretend you did not hear it. Rule 7. Should your utensils fall, leave it there. Do not bend down to pick it up, or you risk seeing something under the table that shouldn't be there. Rule 8. If you hear footsteps following you as you leave, do not turn around. Slow your pace until the sound fades away. I read through the list twice, each rule more unsettling than the one before. My mouth went dry as I realized how specific they were. These weren't rules for a quaint diner experience. They were warnings. My eyes darted back to Rule 1. Never sit facing the entrance unless you are the first customer to arrive. A chill ran down my spine as I glanced over my shoulder at the glass door. "Look at this," Eric whispered, pointing at Rule 4. "If you hear soft humming while eating, close your eyes. What is this place? A haunted house?" I forced a laugh, but my heart wasn't in it. "It's probably just some elaborate gimmick," I said, trying to convince myself. You know, to get people talking. "Yeah, right," Eric replied, his voice tinged with skepticism. "Well, we came here for the experience. Let's just roll with it." He looked at me, waiting for some kind of agreement. I nodded, feeling a tight knot of anxiety form in my chest. We flipped open the menus and pretended to browse the food options, though neither of us really had an appetite. My eyes kept drifting back to the rules, especially Rule 1. "Wait," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "We weren't the first ones here," and I trailed off, glancing at the door. Through the grimy glass, something moved. I couldn't make it out clearly, just a dark silhouette shifting in and out of the foggy night. It was tall, unnaturally so, and seemed to sway as it stood there. I blinked, trying to focus, but it faded into the darkness. "What?" Eric asked, leaning forward. "What did you see?" "There's something out there," I muttered, not taking my eyes off the door. "I don't know what it was, but it looked—" "Don't mess with me," he interrupted, his voice strained. "This place is already creepy enough." "I'm not messing with you," I snapped, turning back to face him. "I swear I saw something." We were both silent, the unease between us growing thicker. The rules weren't a joke. I was sure of it now. This place had its own set of laws, its own way of operating, and we were already violating one. The tension between us grew thicker with each passing second. I kept glancing at the entrance, scanning for any signs of movement through the glass. My mind replayed the brief glimpse of the shadowy figure I'd seen outside, and an icy fear gripped my chest. Eric shifted nervously across from me, tapping his fingers on the table. We sat there in silence, waiting. The waitress reappeared, sliding up to our table without a sound, her hollow eyes staring straight through us. My skin crawled at the sight of her. Remembering Rule 2, I bit my tongue and stared at the menu in front of me, resisting the urge to greet her over or even acknowledge her presence. Eric's eyes widened, as if he had to force himself to stay quiet. After a long, unsettling pause, the waitress finally spoke, her voice monotone and distant. "What would you like to order?" She didn't ask it like a question, more like a command. The words felt cold and wrong, echoing strangely in the air around us. It was as if the sound didn't belong in this place. Eric coughed and glanced at me, seeking some form of validation. I nodded subtly, indicating he should answer first. He took a deep breath and said, "I'll have a black coffee and pancakes." His voice trembling slightly, but he managed to get the words out. The waitress turned her gaze to me, her eyes boring into mine like a predator assessing its prey. I swallowed hard, forcing myself to meet her eyes for only a moment before I replied. "Same for me, please." She didn't react, didn't even blink. She just scribbled something onto her notepad and turned to leave. As she walked away, I felt an overwhelming sense of relief, as though a great weight had lifted off of my chest. I exhaled slowly, my heartbeat gradually returning to a more regular rhythm. "That was weird," Eric muttered, breaking the silence between us. "Did you see how she looked at us?" I nodded, rubbing my hands together to warm them. "Yeah, like she was judging us for even being here," I replied, keeping my voice low. And the way she spoke, it was like she didn't even care what we ordered, almost like it didn't matter. We sat in silence for a few minutes, staring at each other, too afraid to voice the questions racing through our minds. We both knew something wasn't right. This place felt wrong, like it was bending reality in subtle ways, making us question our perceptions. After what felt like an eternity, the waitress returned with her orders. She placed the coffee cups and plates in front of us, with meticulous precision, her movements almost robotic. "Enjoy your meal," she intoned, before turning on her heel and drifting back to the shadows. "Did you hear that?" Eric whispered, leaning closer to me. She said, "Enjoy your meal." It was like she was forcing herself to say it. I nodded, my eyes locked on the steaming cup of coffee in front of me. I had an overwhelming urge to down the coffee and leave, to get as far away from this diner as possible. But something inside me, perhaps morbid curiosity, kept me rooted in my seat. I picked up my fork and prodded at the pancakes, watching the syrup ooze slowly down the sides. Then, it started. A soft melodic humming filled the air around us. My heart skipped a beat as I remembered Rule 4. If you hear soft humming while eating, immediately close your eyes and wait for the humming to stop. "Eric," I hissed, grabbing his wrist. His eyes widened in alarm as he, too, began to hear the sound. "Close your eyes, now." "What?" he stammered, his fork frozen in midair. "Just do it," I snapped, shutting my own eyes tightly. I heard Eric mutter a curse before following suit. The humming grew louder, swelling into a haunting lullaby that reverberated through my skull. It was everywhere, in the air, in my ears, inside my own head. My grip on the fork tightened until my knuckles turned white. I kept my eyes squeezed shut, trying to focus on anything but the unnerving sound. I felt a cold presence sweep through the room, like a gust of wind in an enclosed space. My eyes prickled, and the air grew thick and suffocating. Every instinct screamed at me to open my eyes, to look at what was happening around us, but I knew that would break the rule. I had to stay still. I had to endure. The humming seemed to circle our table, changing in pitch and rhythm as if it was studying us, trying to coax us into making a mistake. My breathing grew ragged, my chest tightened with fear. I wanted to reach out to Eric, to feel some form of connection, but I was too afraid to move. Then, as abruptly as it began, the humming ceased. I held my breath, waiting, listening. I heard Eric's shaky voice beside me, but no other sound disturbed the air. "It's over," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "I think we can open our eyes now." I hesitated, then slowly cracked my eyes open. The diner was exactly as it had been before, but it felt different, colder, darker. I glanced at Eric, who was as pale as a ghost. His eyes were wide, darting around the room in a panic. "Did you feel that?" he asked, his voice trembling. "It was like something was right here." "Yeah," I replied, my mouth dry. I glanced at the other patrons, expecting to see them staring at us, judging us for our fear. But they all sat motionless, eating their meals as if nothing had happened. I glanced down at my plate, my appetite completely gone. The pancakes looked wrong somehow, grayer, like the color had drained from them. I pushed the plate away, my stomach churning. "Let's get out of here," Eric muttered, his eyes darting nervously to the entrance. I don't care about the rules anymore. I want to leave. I opened my mouth to agree when the waitress returned, appearing silently at the edge of our table. My heart nearly stopped. Rule 2, I reminded myself. Don't speak unless spoken to. I clamped my mouth shut and waited, my heart pounding in my ears. Would you like anything else? She asked, her voice devoid of emotion. I shook my head, avoiding her gaze. She lingered for a moment, her presence sending a chill down my spine, before turning away and gliding back to the counter. Okay, that's it, Eric whispered harshly. We're leaving now. I nodded, feeling a lump form in my throat. As we prepared to stand up, I glanced at the menu again, my eyes catching the list of rules. Rule 8 loomed in my mind like a warning. If you hear footsteps following as you leave, do not turn around. Slow your pace until the sound fades away. We weren't done yet. The worst was yet to come. Eric stood up abruptly, his chair scraping loudly against the floor, cutting through the oppressive silence that hung in the diner. A sense of dread washed over me. There was a nagging feeling that we were far from done with this place. Eric reached for his wallet, tossing a few bills onto the table. Let's go, he muttered under his breath, his eyes wide and darting towards the entrance. He wanted out, and so did I. We started walking towards the door. The air around us seemed to thicken with every step. My legs felt heavy, as though I was wading through mud. The soft clinking of cutlery and hushed murmurs of the other patrons filled the space, but my senses were hyper-focused on our escape. Then, just as we were a few feet from the door, I heard it. The distinct scrape of a chair behind us. My heart dropped. Someone had joined our table. I glanced at Eric, whose face had gone ghostly white. Oh no, he whispered, barely audible over the diner's eerie ambience. Rule 3. Slowly I turned back to look. There, sitting in my seat, was a tall, lanky figure. The man wore an old-fashioned suit, the kind you'd see in pictures from decades past. His head was bent forward, his hair hanging over his face like a dark curtain, obscuring his features. A wave of cold swept over me. The atmosphere around him felt wrong, as if he didn't belong in this world. We have to follow the rule, I hissed at Eric, trying to keep my voice steady. Get back to the table, now. With reluctance, we approached the stranger. He remained utterly still, his head angled forward, as if studying something invisible on the table. The room seemed to grow darker, colder. The air pressed down on my chest. My palms were slick with sweat, and I could feel my pulse pounding in my throat. I grabbed my cup of coffee, my hands trembling, and placed it in front of the stranger. Here, I managed to say, with my voice barely above a whisper. Have a sip. His hand moved in a slow, deliberate motion as he reached for the cup. His fingers were unnaturally long and thin, with skin that seemed almost translucent. He lifted the cup to his lips, taking a slow, deliberate sip. A chill crawled up my spine, and I fought the urge to look away. Restroom, I croaked, nudging Eric. We need to go. Eric nodded, his eyes locked on the stranger. We backed away from the table, careful not to break eye contact until we reached the restroom door. The moment we were inside, we both exhaled, as though we had just come up for air after being submerged in dark water. What the hell was that? Eric rasped, clutching the edge of the sink. Who was that guy? I don't know, I replied, my voice shaky. But we had to follow the rule. Now we wait until the clock chimes. Seconds felt like minutes as we stood there, listening to our own ragged breaths echoing in the tiny room. My mind raced, trying to process what had just happened. The air was stifling, pressing down on us, as if the diner itself was alive, watching our every move. Then, the cafe clock outside began to chime. 1, 2, 3 chimes. We exchanged a glance, swallowing the lump of fear lodged in our throats. It was time to return. As we stepped out of the restroom, we dared to approach the table. It was empty. The stranger was gone, leaving only our 2 cups and the uneaten plates of pancakes behind. I exhaled, shakily, but my relief was short-lived. As we turned back towards the entrance, something metallic clattered against the floor. I froze. My fork had fallen, clinking loudly as it hit the ground, spinning a few times before settling just under the table. I felt my heart leap into my throat. Rule 7. Should your utensils fall, leave it there. Do not bend down to pick it up, or you risk seeing something under the table that shouldn't be there. Leave it, I whispered urgently to Eric, who was staring wide-eyed at the fork. Don't look under the table. He nodded, but his eyes were wide with fear. I could feel the tension radiating off of him, his body rigid and tense. We were both aware of what Rule 7 warned us about, and yet the urge to look was almost unbearable, like an itch in the back of my mind that I couldn't scratch. Then we heard it. A soft, muffled sound coming from beneath the table. My blood ran cold. It was the faint, heart-wrenching sobs of a child, crying softly in the darkness beneath us. My stomach twisted violently, and I had to grip the edge of the table to keep from collapsing. Don't listen, I muttered through my clenched teeth, my eyes fixed on a point far away. It's not real, just focus. The crying grew louder, more desperate, echoing in the small space of the diner. It was the kind of sound that clawed at your heart, demanding your attention. Tears welled up in my eyes, not from sadness, but from sheer terror. I squeezed my eyes shut, trying to drown out the noise, but the cries persisted, coming in waves of anguish and despair, each one stronger than the last. Eric shifted uncomfortably beside me. It's just a trick, he whispered, more to himself than to me. We can't look, we can't. The cries turned into words, garbled and barely recognizable, but unmistakably pleading. Please, help me. The voice tugged at the deepest recesses of my sympathy, igniting an instinct to look, to bend down and see who or what was down there. I clenched my fists so tightly that my nails dug into my palms. It's not real, I repeated, my voice trembling. It's just trying to make us look. The crying continued, now mixed with small shuffling sounds, like tiny feet dragging across the floor. My skin crawled, every nerve screaming for me to glance down and see what was beneath the table. I felt like I was losing my grip on reality. The line between what was real and what wasn't blurred under the pressure of the noise. Then, a tiny hand wrapped around the leg of my chair. I stiffened, my muscles locking up in paralyzing fear. It gripped tightly, almost urgently, as though begging me to help. My heart raced so fast I thought it might burst, my breathing coming out in short, panic gasps. Don't look, I hissed to Eric, fighting the urge to jump up and run. It's not real. The grip on my chair tightened, and the crying turned into a pitiful wail. My eyes burned from the effort of not looking down, of not acknowledging the nightmare unfolding beneath us. I could feel my sanity teetering on the edge, about to break. And then, as abruptly as it had started, it stopped. The hand released its grip. The crying faded into silence, and the air around us returned to its suffocating stillness. I dared to glance at Eric, who was pale and shaking, his eyes wide and haunting. Did you see that? He croaked, his voice barely above a whisper. I nodded, swallowing hard. Yeah, but we didn't look under the table. We followed the rule. He exhaled shakily, his hand still gripping the edge of the table. Let's get out of here, he muttered, his voice strained. I can't take this anymore." "Agreed," I replied, feeling a wave of nausea wash over me. We stood up slowly, careful not to glance under the table as we backed away. I couldn't help but notice that the rest of the diner continued on as if nothing had happened. The patron still eating, the waitress still standing behind the counter with her hollow stare. We started towards the exit, moving cautiously. As we reached the door, I heard it, a faint, distant whisper of footsteps following us. My body tensed, remembering Rule 8. If you hear footsteps following you as you leave, do not turn around. Slow your pace until the sound fades away. "Don't turn around," I warned Eric, my voice strained. "Just walk slowly." We moved forward, each step heavier with fear as the footsteps echoed behind us. I fought every instinct to look back, to see what was trailing us, but I knew if I did, we'd break the rule, and whatever awaited us on the other side of that broken rule would be far worse than anything we had encountered so far. The door was just a few feet away. My hand reached out, grasping the gold handle. I pushed it open. The footsteps stopped as we crossed the threshold into the foggy night. I turned to Eric, both of us breathing heavily, our faces pale and drawn. "Let's go," I muttered, my voice barely holding together, "and never come back." We hurried down the street, the diner's oppressive aura fading behind us. Neither of us spoke, too afraid of what we might say, of what might still be lingering in the air around us. As we rounded the corner, I chanced a final glance back. The diner stood silent, its dim neon sign flickering in the fog. For a moment, I thought I saw a shadow at the window, staring out, watching us. I looked away and quickened my pace. Whatever had happened in there, I knew one thing for certain. We were never coming back.